We have some of the highest workers' comp costs, some of the highest unemployment insurance costs. We're one of only 2 states with a state-level gross receipts tax, B&O tax, and there's a heavy regulatory burden. It is getting heavier. Even in a recession, the state government, local governments didn't really back off on that. They keep promulgating more and more and more regulations. So we have an approach in my campaign that says, look, we don't need to be the cheapest state in America in which to do business, but we can't afford to be one of the most expensive either. So the second area beyond cost is workforce. I have a very intense focus in this campaign on K-12 funding and reform and on higher education funding. And I think that surprised people because they hadn't seen a governor's race in at least 20 years with a really strong focus on education. And when you talk to folks out in manufacturing firms and high-tech firms and services firms, they're all concerned that notwithstanding a high unemployment rate, it's often difficult to fill jobs that they have available with finding the people with the skills they need in our state. And that's because our public schools are underperforming, underserving our kids, and it's because we're underfunding and actually decimating the funding for our higher education system. So funding is a key element along with the need for reform. The question is, how do we do it? Well, the governor is saying, well, we've got to increase taxes. The first thing to understand about that is what they mean is taxes on business. Just make no mistake about it, that's where they're aiming for. I mean, that's where most of the tax increases have been aimed in the last several years, except for the soda pop and bottled water tax. The second thing to understand is that it's just not realistic. Because the voters have made it very clear, and to some extent the business community has also made it very clear that taxes are pretty high in the state already. So what I'm saying is we've got to reprioritize education. My proposal is to limit the growth of non-education spending to 6% of biennium and to devote the balance of that growth in the budget to education. So 2 out of 3 new dollars would go to education over the next 8 years. And that would allow us to increase funding for K-12 above their baseline increase by $3.7 billion and would allow us to invest $1 billion in higher ed above their baseline increase over the next 8 years. In other words, we have to prioritize our schools. We've got to put the kids first. What's been happening is they've been coming second for a long time. What I want to do is take all of non-education spending and say we're going to let it grow 6% of biennium as a whole. Some parts could grow faster than 6% if needed. Some parts could grow less quickly than 6%. But clearly that means we've got to address health care inflation. And here there is some good news because we have been relatively successful in bending Medicaid cost inflation over the last 3 or 4 years. Governor Gregoire deserves a lot of credit for bringing that inflation rate down closer to CPI, closer to 4.5%. We need to continue to do that. We need to address inflation for health insurance premiums for state workers. Believe it or not, we now spend more on health insurance premiums for government workers than on the entire higher education budget. And we're going to continue to fund key safety net programs like Medicaid, but let's recognize we have grown Medicaid massively in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, we spent twice as much on higher ed than Medicaid. Now we spend twice as much on Medicaid than higher ed. So